I was around 8 or 9 when this happened. I went to visit my grandparents on the other side of town. They lived 5 minutes away from an elementary school, and I would often walk to it to play on the playground. A young family with a daughter my age lived right next door, and we would play together whenever I came over. Well, one day we decided to take a walk after having some fun at the park. We still had a lot of energy and dinner wasn't quite ready yet, so we wandered throughout the neighborhood. We were laughing and picking flowers along the way when I noticed a white van. We continued our walk, and before you know it, I had completely forgotten all about it. My friend had stopped to tie her shoe, and I was looking around for more flowers to pick when I realized that we had gone a lot further than we ever had before. I didn't recognize the houses in front of me, and it was going to get dark very soon. As soon as that thought entered my mind, I see the white van rounding the corner, heading straight towards us. My stomach sank. It was the same van from earlier, but something seemed different. They stopped in the middle of the road and stared at us. I told my friend that we needed to go, and I asked her if she recognized the houses around us or the van in front of us. Of course, she didn't for either. I tell her that we should probably head home, and she agrees. The van then drives past us slowly, and the man in the passenger seat rolls down the window. Excuse me, do you girls know where, Apple Street is? We both say no, and I get a good look at the van. It has a picture of a vacuum on the side, and a company name I can't remember. He tells us that they're cleaning houses in the neighborhood, and they can't seem to find the street they're looking for. I know I'm not supposed to talk to strangers, so I grab my friend's hand and tell the men sorry, but no, we don't, and we keep walking. We begin our walk home, but my uneasy feeling goes stronger every step of the way. We were going back the same way we'd came, when I started to recognize the houses. We were only about 10 minutes away at this point. Then I hear it, the van coming down the street behind us. I tell my friend to grab a rock from the path, because now I was sure they were following us. I was scared, but I knew we were not too far from my grandparents' house, and we could get there faster if we ran. So that's what we do. Picture 2 terrified 8-year-old girls running down the street with softball-sized rocks in their hands. I look back and see the van racing after us. I can hear someone yelling. It's the man driving, and I hear the word directions. I stop because I'm out of breath, and I think maybe that's all they wanted. Maybe I was just overreacting. Boy, was I wrong. As soon as I stop, my friend does too, and so does the van. I get a good look at the driver this time, and he's explaining that all they wanted was directions. But I knew that something was wrong, and before I could even get any words out, the sliding door blew open, and a man in the back started rushing towards us. We pelted the rocks at him, and ran as fast as we could to my grandparents' house. When we got inside, we started crying our eyes out. My mom had apparently arrived while we were gone. I run to her and my grandma, and told them what just happened. She runs outside yelling to my grandma to call the cops while she looks for the van. She sees it parked 2 houses down, and she charges it like a bull. I had run out after her, so I'm standing there screaming. My mom is tiny, but she is fierce, and was in mama bear mode. The van started to pull away, but I'll never forget what happened next. She jumped onto the hood of the van and started beating in their window. They stop, and she yells that she's making a citizen's arrest, and they need to stop the car now. They act like they're going to. They slowly pull over and park, but as soon as she gets off the hood, they race off. Thank God she managed to remember their entire license plate. When the police get there, they ask us so many questions. I try to explain everything that happened from the moment I first saw the van. They run the license plate number, and it comes back as out of state. They say I can go now, and they want to speak to my mom alone. When she comes back inside, I hear her talking to my grandma in the kitchen. What she said makes my blood run cold to this day. The man who owned the car was linked to a kidnapping out of state, and had a bolo out for his arrest. The police ended up arresting all 3 men, and we had to go in to give an official statement. My friend, my mom, and I picked all three of them out of the lineup, and they were charged with kidnapping out of state and our attempted kidnapping. I never went walking in my grandparents' neighborhood after that, and I still cringe when I see a white van. That's when I realized there's a reason for all those creepy white van stories after all. In the fall of 2015, I began college in a very small town in the middle of nowhere. Its population as of 2019 is 55,489. This town was right in the middle of the Midwestern state I lived in the middle of the Great Plains. The town was pretty much only existent because of the college. It was a state college, which has about 20,000 students a year. As you could imagine, the college brought in a plethora of faculty, business, and really put the town on the map. I personally stuck out like a sore thumb. You see, even though I lived in the Bible Belt, I had been Wiccan since I was 15. I never identified with Jesus and God when I grew old enough to dissect the Christian faith. A big aspect about my personality is that I am very accepting. I mention this because it ultimately led to some chaos later on. I'm the class clown mom friend type. I'm sure you know the type. Goofy and caring, pretty much ride or die. So, I was in the middle of nowhere at the beginning of my college career, and I was surrounded by strangers who were just as nervous and awkward as I was. Due to being in the middle of the Bible Belt, my friends really loved my tarot card, medium, future-seeing persona. And quickly, whilst making new friends, I ran into a few folks who wanted to learn how to read tarot. We lived in the same dorm community. They were nice, and I loved teaching. So that's how I ended up getting into cahoots with Alex, Davis, April, Sam, Rosie, Katie, and Sky. They were friends from the year prior, so I was sort of folded into the friend group as the newest, shiniest object. After mentioning that I read tarot, the group was over the moon. One afternoon, in the basement of our dormitory, I had a tarot reading session for the group. It was a lazy fall day, mid-November, surrounded by soda cans, Kit Kats, and our leftover schoolwork. I began to read each and every group member's cards. With reading, you start to peek into a person's soul. Each card gives you a sliver of personhood. I quite regularly have to console people for the truth that lies within the reading. I've often had to play the role of therapist after the cards read people for filth, so it was unsurprising to me when the group sat in shocking curiosity, goosebumps prickling their arms. It was a normal response. Hours flew by. I did general readings, question-based readings, love-life readings, you name it. As time rolled on, more of my talent slipped out. Soon I was reading palms, giving psychic advice, talking about my Wiccan journey. I believed that what you take from the earth you should give back. It's inherent to my belief system to do everything with love, to never mean any ill will. Alex asked me if I could teach them about my beliefs. Then Katie, then Davis. Before I knew it, everyone in the group had asked for an impromptu teaching. Don't get this wrong. I loved teaching, but more so I craved this positive attention. My childhood was quite awful, and I was very abused. I just wanted people who cared about me. These people were some of the first to really seem to care, who were really interested in what I had to say. So with rose-colored glasses, I began a fun little info sesh with my brand new friends. I didn't see the warning signs. What started out as little meetings in the study rooms turned into hour-long lectures where the group hung to every word I said. As we got closer, more of my horrific past was uncovered. I shared tales of my trauma, of all the times I should have died, the beatings, how my own mom had tried to murder me. I thought I had found my tribe. I was really excited and pleased to be around folks. I didn't start to see the warning signs until it was too late. Things went smoothly for a while. A routine of teaching the group, hanging out, having dinner, talking about normal things, like school and what was going on in the dorm communities. I really liked it, actually. One of the group members, Davis, was transitioning female to male, and he struggled a lot with his identity. He was raised in a pretty strict household, so his transition wasn't exactly taken very well by his family. He also struggled with BPD, which made people in the group very uncomfortable. I think mostly because they didn't understand it. Keep in mind, mental health at the time wasn't really something people were open about, as it was right in the middle of the Bible Belt. So Davis would occasionally act erratic, start fights, get worked up, cry randomly. I'm sure part of this was due to transitioning. I can't imagine how emotional and hard it would be to go through that. What really set things off, though, was when Davis started doubting if he should fully transition or not. Davis had already been on testosterone for quite some time, was male-presenting, but didn't have top surgery yet. One day, right before spring break, Davis had worn a dress, makeup, and heels around campus. At the time, I thought it was kind of strange, but I figured it was Davis's life, so it didn't really matter to me. The rest of the group, however, started to obsess over this. It was very out of character, but the group thought there was more to it. When Davis left for class, adorned in his dress and heels, Alex began to speculate. There was a long, weird history between Alex, Davis, and Sky. One where Davis was sort of relationship-like flirting with both Alex and Sky, creating some animosity. Alex and Sky were best friends, but Davis had sort of wriggled his way into both of their hearts. Alex wasn't one to really discuss their feelings, so they pretended this love triangle didn't affect them. But Alex had become bitter. After Davis walked out, Sky in tow, Alex began their speculation. What's wrong with him? Why is he acting like that? It's like I hardly know him. Katie, one for gossip, joined right in. Honestly, it's like Davis is a completely different person. I don't know who this is, but I hate him. He's taking advantage of Sky. The rest of the conversation began to snowball. It was a frustrating situation for those who had been in the friend group for a long time. I was pretty much indifferent. I didn't exactly know what was going on, and honestly, I thought they were kind of making a fuss out of nothing. If you're uncomfortable with what's happening, then just talk it out. I digress. I had been working on a term paper, not really minding too much about the conversation, until suddenly April asked me, "Hey, do you think you could be messing around with some bad magic?" I shrugged. Davis had asked about love spells and other things that I don't really mess with. He was really into the idea that he could just put a spell on someone and make them fall in love with him. I had told him that taking away free will is something you should never mess with. The universe doesn't take kindly to those who harm, obstruct, or take free will away from someone. April had been there when Davis asked. When Alex looked questioningly at her, April spilled the beans. Something in Alex's face contorted, as if you could see their heartbreak turn into pure rage. Alex excused themselves, and that was that. I remember being a little distressed about the situation. I really hated conflict back then. I was spending spring break at Rosie's house. Her and Sam lived in the same town. Alex and Katie would be there too. When I agreed to spend the break with them, it was before drama had started, but by the time we got to spring break, it was already too late to change anything. I spent the whole break listening to this conspiracy grow. The four of them had begun to elaborate on this black magic idea. Rosie brought up the thought that maybe Davis was possessed. I told them that I didn't think this was likely. I had a feeling things were about to go awry. The mood just felt weird. I had never been in the presence of a group of people who just accused another of being possessed. When I shot down this idea, they mentioned the time Davis growled the week prior. We were playing a game online when Davis growled a response, and I had jokingly said he sounded like a demon. I still told them it was nothing, but they would not let up. Realizing I was in a bit of trouble, I came up with a quick solution. I told them we could do some protection spells so if anything would go awry, it would be okay. That seemed to appease them well enough, or so I thought. Luckily, they left the topic alone until we were heading back to campus. We need to do an exorcism on Davis, Rosie said, a wild look in her eyes. Rosie had dabbled in paganism before she'd met me, so she already had a solid set of beliefs and theories. The issue here, however, was that Rosie and Sam thought they could use their paganism as a tool to control those around them. I tried to correct this thought process, as it was against my belief system, which they seemed to be receptive to, at least until they felt threatened. Davis had sent a text message to Rosie about some drama with Alex and Sky, sending Rosie into a downward spiral. Before I knew it, the narrative had suddenly shifted into Davis is possessed by the demon Lilith. I didn't know what to do. I told them he wasn't. It just didn't make sense. But I was too late. I didn't know. I figured that if I got back to campus, took some time away from them, everyone would calm down. So that's exactly what I did. I tried to do as much damage control as I could on the rest of the ride, but then when I got back to the dorm, I locked myself away. When asked, I just said I was behind on work from spring break. Things were relatively quiet, and I felt safe. I figured it was temporary insanity or something. I was sat downstairs talking to April a few days after I had locked myself away. We were just chit-chatting about what she had done over the break, when I saw Rosie and Katie suddenly rush past the sitting room. They were frantic. They waved at us when they ran past but didn't say anything. A bit later, Sky ran in the same direction, crying. When he saw us, he rushed in. Davis said he's a demon and needed to be exorcised. I jumped to my feet and started running towards his dorm room. Sam and Alex stood in the hallway. Their faces hardened when they saw me, Sky, and April walking up. "You're not allowed in there. Davis is a danger to you," Sam said. "He admitted he was possessed." "He's not possessed. Just let me in there." We bickered for a long time, until I said that if they were going to do an exorcism, they needed me in there. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. Davis was laid on the bed, tied down to the bed frame. He was crying. Rosie and Katie were inside, setting things down around the bed. Rosie held a tattered old book in her hand, and there was sage burning on a plate. Katie yelled something, but I couldn't focus. I just kept thinking all of a sudden that these people were fucking crazy. All I could see was Davis, crying their eyes out on the bed. "I'm sorry. I didn't know I was possessed. I didn't know I was going to hurt you," Davis wailed, shaking. "Shh, we're going to get the demon out. You're going to be okay." I kept saying that he wasn't possessed, but nobody would listen to me. And that's when I saw the knife. It was bronze in color, with something dark crusted on it. It sat in a bowl from the dining hall, and a mix of what looked like salt, and also blood. In shock, I looked over to Rosie, spotting a bloody gauze on her arm. It was like my world stopped. At this point, I had realized that these people were fucking crazy. I'd seen enough scary movies that I could only imagine what was going to happen. I grabbed the knife and cut through the cloth that tied Davis down, grabbed his wrist and bolted from the room. I called Davis's mom and told her to come get him. We went to my dorm until she got there, with me trying to talk some sense into him. Davis went home shortly after. Rosie, Katie, Sam, and Alex were blowing up my phone. April had come with me when I ran out with Davis. When he had gone home, she started to talk about how I needed to be careful, because if Hillary Clinton were elected president, I was special. My mother had told me that she had to kill me, or else the government would get to me, that I was special. April knew this. Apparently she believed it too. I just nodded, telling her I needed some sleep. After she left, I immediately started filing paperwork to transfer schools. I moved 2 hours away, blocking everyone in the group's phone numbers. I couldn't believe everything that had happened, but looking back, I started to see that the signs were there all along. They would always say things like, "You're a witchy Jesus," and had blind faith in everything I said. The most memorable moment was when I told them that the sky was actually green. I was just joking around being a sarcastic asshole, but April and Alex just nodded. When I said I was joking, April defended them, saying, "Well, technically the sky just reflects the earth, so it really is green." Hindsight is 20/20. I accidentally started a cult, creating a small hellhole where everyone blindly believed everything I said and thought I was a modern-day Jesus. So, to my former cult members, let's never meet again. And also, please, get some help. This all happened a long time ago, in 1994. I was only 8 years old, and my worldview was as narrow as you'd expect any child's to be. Aside from this memory I'm about to share, that year was marked by a nail-biting series of penalty kicks that ended in a nervous Roberto Baggio, aka the savior of Italy, kicking the final shot over and above the net in a crushing defeat to Italy and his own career. For the remainder of the year, I was glued to my Game Boy, playing World Cup USA 94 and trying to recreate the game with a better ending for Baggio. Of course, the graphics were bleeding edge at the time. We had just moved from my childhood home in a bad part of town to a new home in suburbia. My dad's small business had finally started making money after 3 years of losing it, and my parents wanted to give us kids some space to stretch out and play. At the time, I only had an older sister, who was 11. I was convinced this new house was haunted, but kinda thought it was a bit cool actually. My house sat on 3 acres of land, bordered by woods, and was pretty far tucked back from the rest of the neighborhood. My parents wanted to double the house in size, and add a nice kitchen for my mom who enjoys cooking for guests. They went through the motions of getting the addition permitted, and tried to find a contractor, but didn't like anyone they met. Then an employee of my father recommended her brother, Steve, who was a young contractor, early 30s. He'd just gotten his license and was very hungry for work. It was summertime, and my sister and I didn't have school, so my parents would leave her to watch me while they were at work. Twice a week, my grandma came to pick up my sister for dance lessons. I would only be alone for 90 minutes or so, and I was good about keeping myself occupied, so nobody ever thought it was a problem. On the days that we were together, Steve began to work on the house, and aside from the occasional hello, he would come and work a little at a time. It started off well, with a solid few weeks of work, but then he started coming less and less. The times he did show up, he'd spend 10% of the time working, and the rest of the time split between dancing around with headphones in and jumping on my trampoline. Yeah, he danced a lot. I didn't really understand why an adult was dancing so much while he was supposed to be working, but that also didn't really bother me, since my sister was a dancer. But my trampoline, that thing was my pride and joy. I had to vacuum the house and rake leaves for months to save up the $240 to be able to afford that thing, and there he was wearing his heavy steel-toed boots while he jumped about haphazardly. I wasn't the type to start a conflict, so I begrudgingly let it slide. One day, though, after he spent a larger-than-average jumping session on it, I went outside to inspect and found a massive tear along the edge of the trampoline. That was that. Little high-up Sam had had enough of Steve's boots. I finally complained to my parents that he ripped my trampoline, and then it all came out. He only came for a few hours a couple of times a week, and mostly just hung out and danced and played on the trampoline while my sister and I sat in the back room. I didn't fully understand what this all meant, but I remember my parents calling him to yell at him. As they yelled, I felt a big wave of guilt wash over me. I knew it was hard work, and my favorite thing about the trampoline was that it was big enough for everyone to share it. I didn't want to be a jerk, so the next time he came over, I approached him and tried to apologize. I had practiced what I was going to say. I was going to tell him I was sorry that I told on him, but I'd worked hard to buy that trampoline with my own money. He could still use it, but only if he would take off his boots before jumping on it. As I approached him, though, he threw his hammer to the ground, pointed at me, and started screaming loudly. I don't remember what he said. I was so shocked and definitely didn't expect that reaction, so I ran away, and my sister, who had heard the yelling and saw me running back, called my parents. Later that night, my parents let us know that they'd fired Steve, and he wouldn't be coming back anymore. They were on the search for a new contractor to replace him. That week, my sister and I would hear a car pulling up, idling a bit, then pulling away. We looked out every time, and it was Steve's red truck. It didn't seem strange for some reason. Maybe he was finalizing some plans to hand over the job to the next guy. A child's mind is something else. One day, my grandma came to pick up my sister for dance, and minutes after they'd pulled away, I had my nose buried in World Cup USA '94. It was 30 seconds into my latest Italy vs. Brazil match when I heard the rhythmic crunching of leaves outside my window. They stopped suddenly. Remember, I thought my house was haunted, so in my mind it was a ghost or a skeleton or some possessed doll. I freaked out and lay frozen in my bed. Then I heard sounds on the window frame, like something clawing to get a grip on the handle and trying to open them. The crunching footsteps started again and moved to my other window, followed by the same scratching sounds. At this point, I put the Game Boy down and ran out of my room and into the living room, which connects to the foyer. As I was running, I saw a figure move across the front windows and knew it was Steve. Whew, not a possessed doll after all. He smiled at me and tapped gently on the glass. Hey Sam, can you and I just talk? I feel really bad about what I did. I stared at him for a second, not quite sure what to do, before I started to feel uneasy. Come on, just let me in for a second. I want to make this right. Something felt off. His eyes seemed off. His smile seemed off. So I replied, I'm not allowed to let you in. Sorry. Just like that. A switch flipped in his head, and he started pounding the window angrily. Don't play games. You better let me in right now. His face turned red. His eyes went wide. It almost seemed like he was drooling. Confused, I turned and ran back into my room and locked the door. Hey, if you don't open the door, I'm going to break this window. I know you're in there. I screamed that I was calling the police and telling them that he was there, a bluff. Everyone had a cordless phone in their room except for me, but I didn't know what else to do. Just like that, I heard him pound on the glass one last time before hearing his truck drive out of the driveway. Shaken, I left my room and called my mom. A few days later, she told me he would no longer be bothering me. I thought she had done her mom thing and given him a stern talking to. My mom was terrifying, a short Italian woman who spit fireballs and wasn't afraid to hit you with a wooden spoon, so that seemed the obvious conclusion. When I was 19 and home from college one night, I asked my parents whatever happened with him. They told me that according to his sister, their employee, he had fallen down a drug spiral, likely meth, and lost control. A few days after the incident at our house, he had been accused of assaulting another young boy, and the police found incriminating photos. After that, he jumped off a local bridge and ended his own life before he could be arrested. That's when it all hit me. My memory as a child was horribly skewed. He was not just trying to talk to me, and wasn't mad at me for not letting him in. Looking back as an adult, it was clear Steve had some issues he was working through. Being gay in the 90s must not have been easy, and it makes me sad to think about what kind of person he might have been if society had just accepted him. But what he did to the other boy is absolutely unacceptable, and there's no way that can be justified, no matter how he might have tried to. It might have been me that day. I was lucky to have dodged him. When I was 7, I lived in a dusty, vacant part of the West with an atmosphere straight out of a Judy Blume novel, despite everyone in my neighborhood living on large, isolated plots of land, mostly being ranching families. Kids played hockey in the streets, crime was minimal to non-existent, and everybody knew everyone else. I had a very tight-knit group of friends. Names changed to protect privacy. Well, let's call them Shirley, Natalie, and Bailey. We'd all been friends since before we could even walk, mostly because we were the same age and all lived in the same neighborhood. We weren't exactly idiots, but we were definitely sheltered. The same could be said of our parents, many of whom had ended their education after high school, or even a bit sooner, and grew up in a similar, if not the exact same community, where anyone who'd shake your hand was probably trustworthy. That's why no one noticed anything before it was too late. Just before the summer started, a new family moved in. Families moving in wasn't terribly uncommon, but this family had a girl my and my friend's age, so it became a very big deal. Her name was Ella, and her whole family was a bit strange. It took 2 weeks for them to introduce themselves to anyone. Plenty of people went over to introduce themselves, but even when it was obvious people were home, no one came to the door. Finally, word got around that the father was a minister at some church no one in town had heard of, and the wife was working part-time at the tailor's. We spent a lot of time outside and eventually spotted Ella. My friends and I invited her to join our group in whatever we were up to that afternoon. Through that, we learned she had 4 older brothers and an infant sister. She and her whole family had very antiquated gender roles, prayed before and about virtually anything they did, and would casually mention the end of the world as a non sequitur. Despite this, they managed to establish themselves as pillars of the community. The father, let's call him Mr. Cyrus, came to every town hall, and his wife, Miss Cyrus, took up a leadership role in the PTA. I think their wholesome Christian image helped defray what would have otherwise been deeply troubling outbursts of rage, which Mr. Cyrus would exhibit, sometimes right out in public. He'd hear another adult use a phrase like "God damn it," and fly into a frenzy about how dare you forsake our Lord and Savior, taking his name in vain. His wife would make unsolicited, judgmental comments about how other people raise their kids, especially daughters. Despite all that, within a few months you'd never know they hadn't lived there all their lives. The unspoken understanding in this town was that if you left your kids in someone else's care, they had free rein to do whatever they thought best for them and to feed them, instruct them, or discipline them, as if they were your own. The first time I went to Ella's, nothing out of the ordinary happened. The second time, Mr. Cyrus led all of us in prayer before we ate our snack, and afterwards. I mentioned to my mom how I found it irritating, and she basically said, "Their house, their rules." I shrugged it off. Neither of us had any way to know Mr. Cyrus was just testing the waters. A few weeks later, several of our families had gotten together, and Mr. Cyrus brought a rifle out of nowhere and asked us girls if we wanted to shoot some cans. He said to the parents once he'd gotten us excited, "I mean, if you're comfortable with guns." Remember, this is rural America. Not one of us girls hadn't already fired a gun in our lives, and if any of the parents were uncomfortable about guns, they would never admit so in public. Things progressed little by little every time I went over. Within the next few visits, my friends and I were made to participate in a mini Bible study lesson. I guess one of the other girls had told their parents about the praying, because when we were dropped off, Mr. Cyrus said, "Oh, I forgot to mention, Eileen and I had a family Bible study planned for tonight. If you're uncomfortable with that, you can bring the girls back another night." This was the West in the 80s. Christianity was the default, and even people who didn't really practice felt obligated to pretend they did. No one in this town would have objected to their kids participating in a Bible study loud enough for anyone to hear. It didn't even matter, because the Bible study was also sort of fun. None of us complained about it, and we'd all seen how into it Ella seemed, and wouldn't have wanted to hurt her feelings by complaining. I think Mr. Cyrus took that as one of the final go-aheads needed. In late August, Mrs. Cyrus called my and my friend's parents and asked if we wanted to have a sleepover with Ella. Everyone agreed. The first red flag flew up right away. Most of us girls spent half our days off from school doing farm chores and helping around the house, so we were all in jeans. I had never seen Ella in pants ever, but what we wore had never been any sort of problem. When we got there this time, though, Ella had laid out 4 of her dresses on the bed and told us to change into them to look more like girls. We all liked playing dress-up, so we changed without complaint. But when we went downstairs, Mr. Cyrus said, "Look how ladylike you all are. Doesn't that feel better? You've made God very happy." At this point in a playdate, we usually go out back and made mud pies or play tag or something. But instead, Mr. Cyrus jumped right into a Bible lesson. He was basically giving a sermon and talked about heaven and hell and the ways to get into heaven and be sent to hell. He scared our 7-year-old minds half to death about the fires of hell. Then he did what I can only describe as a cartoony attempt at hypnosis. And this was years ago, so it's a little fuzzy, but he dangled some piece of jewelry, like a necklace or something, right in front of us and swung it back and forth. While he did that, he recited Bible verses about telling the truth and repentance and the end times, clean souls entering the glory of heaven. And then he sat us all down on a couch. We were all thoroughly freaked out at this point by the heaven-hell talk, but figured everything else was just a religious ritual of their home, because he'd so carefully desensitized us over the past few months. He talked about sin and repentance, and asked us if we wanted to go to heaven or hell. I think you can guess which we said. He said the only way to get to heaven was to be baptized. One of my friends, Shirley, said she'd already been baptized, but Mr. Cyrus cut them off. Baptized into the real faith, God's faith. He asked if we wanted to know how we could become baptized, and we said yes. He said by confessing our sins and making them right with God, committing to living in a Christian-like way, and most importantly, accepting Jesus as our Savior. Sounded easy enough for us. For the next I don't know how long, there were no clocks in this house, and it was after dark by then. We basically did a very intense Bible study. It could have been anywhere between 10 minutes and 4 hours. When you're little and not accustomed to going to church, any amount of Bible study feels like an eternity. This was interspersed with different prayers for salvation and making promises about rejecting sin and resisting temptation. We were all getting very tired and feeling our patience wearing thin for tolerating others' religious beliefs. Then there was a whole barrage of prepper things. Different types of guns, talk about growing your own food, the importance of self-reliance, basically a lecture on survival skills, but with constant emphasis that the greatest survival skill is being a good Christian. He kept us up most of the night after that, praying and such. He did some ritual with rubbing oil on our foreheads as well. He vaguely talked on and off throughout the night about whether we'd want to go with Ella to a wonderful place with lots of other kids who love Christ. He said he'd ask our parents about taking us there on a weekend trip. I knew when I was agreeing with him that I had no interest, but my mom had taught me the polite thing to do when you get an invitation to something you have no intention of going to is to smile and express interest, then closer to the date say something came up. So I just smiled and expressed interest. He didn't feed us anything the entire time we were there. By the time it started to get light out, we were baptized in the backyard. Then we finally fell asleep, and a few hours later we were picked up. I told my mom I didn't want to go back because it was too religious for me. I told her we were up a lot of the night praying. I told my mom there was no food also, but since I'm such a picky eater, she was too used to hearing they had nothing to eat, when I really just meant something like they served meatloaf and wouldn't make me a grilled cheese instead. We stopped playing with Ella and just kind of put it behind us until high school, mentioning once every few years, remember that weird religious playdate? Since we didn't really understand any of the promises we'd made with Mr. Cyrus, we didn't pay half a mind to keeping them. We were exhausted and surrounded in daily life by Jesus rhetoric that everyone took seriously in the moment, then ignored once the preacher was out of earshot. In high school, it was heavily rumored that Ella's father, Mr. Cyrus, had Florence Houteff, famed for her involvement with the controversial Branch Davidians, visiting his home and leading some sort of prayer circle for him and people from his church. While I still don't know if she really came to visit him, it was all but irrefutably confirmed in high school that Mr. Cyrus belonged to an offshoot of Shepherd's Rod, the Christian apocalyptic extremist group rooted in Seventh-day Adventism. Nobody really talked to them much after that, in town even, because we all considered it a cult. I went out of state after high school, so I have no idea whatever happened with Ella's family, but Mr. Cyrus, let's not meet again.
Good evening all, and welcome. Is dreaming of the dead an ominous sign, or can it be one of great comfort? Only time will tell as you tune in, so get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My dad is the type of man to call bull on anything paranormal. He doesn't believe in ghosts, aliens, or anything of the sort. I tend to follow in his footsteps, and if it were anyone else, I probably wouldn't believe this story. My dad grew up in a poor, small community. My grandparents were incredibly respectful and friendly people, despite the poverty. They made friends with everyone in town and helped anyone that needed a hand. Along came a wealthy, but very lonely man, Bill, who moved in next door. Over time, Bill became very close to my family. He revealed that he was estranged from his children after they tried to steal large sums of money from him. He discovered his ex-wife had been having an affair since before they got married and was simply trying to take advantage of his wealth. Needless to say, the type of help this man needed was comfort, not food, not money. Bill was over for almost every meal, and my dad began to see him as an uncle. Just as my grandparents had learned of his family issues, he had noticed that my grandparents were also struggling financially. Since he despised his family, he wrote a will to give all of his assets to my family. Then, Bill passed away due to old age. As you may have expected, his children came around quickly after. They did not host a funeral service or even attend the service my grandparents funded. They were strictly in town for the inheritance. My grandparents desperately needed the cash and knew that the will entitled them to it. But there was one problem. The will was nowhere to be found. Bill hadn't told anyone where he'd left it, and the money would default to kin without it. After extensive searching, my grandparents were on the verge of giving up. The night before the final day to find the will, my dad had an eerie dream. In his dream, he woke up in bed. At the end of his bed stood Bill. Bill proceeded to speak to him and tell him exactly where the will had been left. He told my dad it was in a safe buried in the basement, in the back right-hand corner. He even led my dad to the spot, told him the combination to the safe, and showed him where it was. My dad woke up very startled and ran to tell my grandparents. With little time and nothing to lose, they checked out the spot in the basement. Sure enough, they dug in the right spot, and there was the safe. They entered the combination from the dream. The safe popped open, and the will sat inside. I often write off paranormal stories as lies, misremembered events, or something similar. I checked with all 4 of my uncles and my grandparents for their version of the story, and they all confirmed it. The first thing that several people asked was why someone would bury a will. This is typically something you don't hide. Although my dad never asked Bill directly, he speculates it was due to some mistrust in the banks. This story took place in the mid-70s, and Bill lived through the Depression. My father tells me that the safe contained more than just the will. In addition to a large sum of cash, it also contained contact information for the executor of the will and witnesses. Bill had moved from several states away, and his executor and witnesses were acquaintances from his home state. The people he chose for these roles cannot be beneficiaries of the will, and he didn't socialize with many people outside of my grandparents. Without that information, my grandparents didn't know who to contact about his death from his home estate. After Bill passed, the local court set out a date for recovering the will. Since Bill's local attorney didn't have a copy, they contacted Bill's bank to see if he had a safety deposit box and searched the house. Both proved fruitless, and neither the executor nor any of the witnesses had come forward. The deadline to recover the will was the following day, and that's when my dad's dream occurred. If the will had not been found, the court would have moved to intestacy proceedings. The court would then appoint an executor to distribute Bill's estate to his default heirs based on a state-defined formula. When my grandparents contacted the executors and witnesses, it was discovered that the executors also had a copy of the will and knew of the safe. The executor and witnesses vouched for the authenticity of the original will in the safe, but the legal battle continued. My grandparents didn't mention how the location of the safe was discovered, but they provided various evidence of the poor relationship between Bill and his kids. The kids claimed fraud, but after deliberating, the probate court ruled in my family's favor, and the will remained valid. I still find it odd that Bill would hide the will, but I think it is possible that it was put in the safe as a place to safeguard it, rather than to keep it hidden. Bill may have assumed that his executor would hear about his death right away and be able to provide the location of the safe and a copy of the will. Unfortunately, it took the opening of the safe to contact the executor. Another idea that my dad has is that the location and combination of the safe may have been told to him by Bill in the past, and it was just buried in his subconscious and he dreamt it. I must admit that was my initial thought as well. My dad told me that he never would have had such a serious conversation with an elderly neighbor. My dad was in high school at the time, so the conversations he had with Bill were light-hearted and appropriate for an elderly man speaking to a kid. The serious conversations, such as the one about Bill's kids, only took place between my grandparents and Bill. There is the possibility that my dad overheard a conversation between my grandparents and Bill, but then you'd expect my grandparents to at least remember that Bill had mentioned a safe. If my dad did put the location and combination of the safe from some distant conversation out of his subconscious at the last possible moment, well, what an incredible mind he has. I asked my dad just how much money my grandparents inherited from Bill, but he wasn't sure of the amount. After the probate court ruling, the kids didn't stick around long. They were apparently pretty wealthy themselves, and were half expecting to not receive any inheritance from their dad. They hadn't spoken in years, so I don't think they were surprised by the will. In fact, my grandparents mentioned that Bill told his kids they wouldn't be getting any of his money after they had tried to steal it from him. From pretty much the first night after my dad passed away, I started seeing him in my dreams. I didn't think anything of it at first, because I figured that's a perfectly reasonable subconscious response to losing a loved one. The weird thing, though, was that he looked seriously real. Everything else in my dream would have that strange cartoonish vibe to it. Yet, I could look at my dad and count the individual hairs on his moustache and on his head. In one of the dreams, I became lucid and realized I was asleep. I asked my dad point blank, "Are you visiting me? Or is this just a figment of my imagination? I need to know." He smiled, hugged me and said, "I'm here with you right now, son, and I always will be. I love you." I woke up suddenly, and as I did, I saw a very light shadow. Had it not moved, I wouldn't have seen it. It was a head and shoulders leaning through the doorway and into my room. As soon as I saw it, it quickly moved away and backed out of the room. Somehow, It was calming rather than scary. It was absolutely amazing, because that's exactly what my dad used to do when I was little, when he left really early for work. He'd pop his head in and say goodbye. The way this shadow moved was exactly the same, and I'm convinced it was him checking in on me. If that wasn't strange enough, my mum called me downstairs that same morning. She tells me to go into the living room, and I look at the floor. I go in, and guess what? Dad's reading glasses had somehow ended up slap bang in the middle of the room. That 110% confirmed it for me. My father passed away in 2016, and I had been struggling with depression, other issues, my path in life, and trying to figure everything out for myself. I was 22, and probably the only person in my family that was mentally prepared for what had happened. I'm not really a religious person, and had no higher power to pray to, and no elders left in my line of life to ask for advice. One night, I was exhausted and completely drained of all my energy, so I decided to call it a night early and go to sleep. Exhausted, I don't remember going to sleep. I found myself waking in the hallway of his old house, right next to his room. This is the room I sleep in now. I swung the door open, and to my surprise, it wasn't my stuff around the room. It was his, but it was all different in some way, like it had been crafted perfectly. He was sitting on his bed watching an old Western movie, one I'd never seen, and I did my best to watch them all with him, so I wasn't sure how I didn't know this one. He was laughing and having a good time. The room was really bright. It hurt my eyes to look at everything. I was so confused. I did what I always did and went and sat across from him under his bedroom window. He always had an extra armchair for anyone who could come over and to have a conversation with him. All of my siblings' friends grew up in a rough spot, so everyone came to him for fatherly advice because he always knew just what to say. I stared at the TV trying to recognize the movie. I couldn't. I heard children laughing outside his window. I turned to look out, and I couldn't see anything. I was blinded by a radiant, warm white light. He stopped laughing and looked at me and said, "You can't see it, because it's not your time yet. But no, it's beautiful, kiddo." I broke down crying, and asked him where I was and why I was with him. He said, "I brought you here because I know you're struggling, and you need to know for sure." He looked so different from when I'd seen him in his final days. He was warm, happy, and healthy. Healthy like I'd never seen him before in my life. Puzzled and sobbing, I looked at him and asked him, "What should I do with my life? What should I focus on?" He told me, "You need to focus on yourself and do right by your lonesome first." I understood, nodding at him. We talked for a bit about life, and then he looked away from his movie. "Why don't you get us something from the corner store like old times?" I wiped the snot from my nose and the tears from my face, and said I would be back with the junk I could carry. I happily jumped out and walked out of the room and into the doorway. He said, "Don't look back. Just keep walking forwards till you head outside, but make sure you close the door all the way." Confused, I did what was commanded, and shut his bedroom door and started walking down the hallway of his old place. Confused, I could still hear him talking, echoing through the hallway. "Keep walking, you'll make it back just fine." It was getting darker and darker as I reached the front door, excited for candy and junk food with my pops, just like when I was a kid. I sprung the front door open only to be blinded by the same white light I couldn't see. I immediately awoke, gasping for air and crying. I attempted to get out of bed and got tangled in the blankets and fell, still crying and freaked out by what had just happened. I quickly ran to the shower and took all my clothes off and hopped in and turned the hot water on. I was trying my best to compose myself and stop crying. My body was flush with emotions. I stayed in the shower for a while, trying to get a grip on everything. Eventually I got out and went back into my room, that was once his, to get dressed. Out of the corner of my eye I spotted his old radio. I never really listened to the radio much. I'd been a huge punk rock fan and kept my own genres. I decided to turn it on, and as soon as I did, Simple Man by Lynyrd Skynyrd came on, and I had never heard this song before that moment in time, and it messed me up royally. I instinctively started crying again once I heard the lyrics. My old man was finishing our talk through music, the kind of music he liked to listen to. Since that day, I've done my hardest and put myself out there in the thick of it. I've asked one of my friends out, and he said yes. We've been dating for a few months, and it's looking really good. I took up leather crafting as a hobby, and really enjoyed it. I also got a raise that's almost doubling my pay, and I get to relocate to a new city soon. Someplace I've never been, and I've been listening to all kind of music I wouldn't have thought twice about listening to before, along with saving for a new hobby, the cello. Since then, I haven't questioned the spirit world. It exists. I was there. I know some people don't believe in gods, and I'm one of them. But I know what world exists, and it's one with our own. I am a sleepwalker and talker. When I get stressed out, I tend to sleepwalk more. But it's a pretty solid thing that my family and roommates are aware of. I've always had bad dreams. I woke up in terror most nights and would scream in my sleep. The most recent bout of sleepwalking has been strange. When things happen, I don't really remember them. At the moment, I'm living with my parents and sister in my family home. So about 3 weeks ago, I apparently rushed out to my mum's as she left for work and slammed on her window. I thought she was stealing her own car. Then 4 days ago I went into my mother's room and woke her up asking why she didn't have a nose. When I was younger I remember an event. I did not think it was real, but last night I found out it was real. I'm from New Zealand, and we have the Maori culture. The weapon of a Maori male warrior is a patu. It's kind of like a clubbed-shaped bone or jade-carved handheld weapon. In my childhood, I distinctly remember walking out of my room and into the kitchen for a glass of water. As I rounded the corner, there was a Maori warrior, complete with flax skirt, full facial tattoos, and a patu, making the dominance gesture, which is poking your tongue out and making an oof sound. I froze and screamed and closed my eyes, and he was gone. I always thought that this was some kind of crazy dream, or my sleepwalking delusion. Last night, me at 30 years of age, I got up and walked through my house into the kitchen, rounded the corner, and what did I see? The same warrior making faces and threatening me. I kind of froze, dropped my cup, and closed my eyes. When I opened them, he was not gone. He had in fact gotten closer to me, making very threatening sounds and looks. I sort of stifled a scream and backed up to the door to the hallway. I opened the door and slammed it and stood behind it. I woke up my sister, and she came out of her room and was yelling at me about making noise while she was asleep. I couldn't form a sentence. I just pointed to the door. She shoves me out the way and opens the door. And wouldn't you know it, The kitchen was empty. I don't know if I was sleepwalking or if the Maori warrior is part of the spiritual house I live in. When dreams become reality, it will always be scary. Last year in June, my grandmother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. It was everywhere, even in her eyes. She was fading fast and said to my father, "I'm ready to go. I want to say goodbye to the kids." Panicked, he called his brother and my mother. My parents are separated, and explained to them what was happening, and to bring my cousins and myself there the next day. The next day we visited her in the hospital, spoke for a bit, though it was really hard. That was the last time I ever hugged her and told her how much she meant to me. She died the very next day. I was on the phone with my father when it happened. I could hear the flat line in the background before he swore, hanging up. They tried reviving her, but she wasn't coming back. She was gone. A couple of months later, after the funeral, I was content in my bed, dreaming I was at my aunt's house. But then it changed. I was on the phone talking to someone, but I could see them. It was Grandma. "Are you okay?" she asked me. "I'll see you next month." I woke up confused and told my mother about this. The next day at work on her lunch, my father called her. They were having a memorial to bury my grandparents' ashes in my grandpa's hometown the next month on their wedding anniversary. Here's where it gets even weirder and sadder. That day, as a final personal goodbye, I sang to them the song Southern Cross by Crosby, Stills and Nash, a song my parents sang to me when I was little, that my grandparents sang to me sometimes too. A few days later I was dreaming again, that I was reorganizing my bookshelves and my cell phone went off. I answered it, and it sounded like a party on the other end, and on the other end were Grandma and Grandpa together, telling me they were all right and that they were happy now. In the dream I started crying, and they started singing Southern Cross. They paused only once to ask me to sing with them. That was the last time I ever dreamt about them. When I woke up, I was crying the last of the song's words dying on my lips. I never told anyone except my mother about this. Turns out a few days prior, she'd seen a figure sitting on our couch. A big figure. We think it was Grandma. I like to think they still come and visit every now and then. In June 2016, someone I hardly knew passed away, weirdly at 2 a.m, which was the time she was shot. I had a terribly strange feeling. I couldn't sleep or calm down. I had no idea who she was or anything. I'd only seen her once. The next day I found out she'd passed. I remember thinking, her name is so familiar, and her death suddenly affected me greatly. For a while after that, I saw her in my dreams. I heard some knocking at the door late at night, but no one was there. My dog looked at the door before the knocking ever happened, but there was no person or animals in sight. Now this is where it gets weird. I went for a jog at midnight to a Catholic school down my block where I pray at a statuette. I prayed for her and my normal prayer. I wanted to continue running, but my dog randomly started limping, so instead, I returned home and went into my yard. I was sitting there. No one moved. But my neighbor's outdoor light randomly turned on when I was thinking about her. The next day, I found out that someone was shot at 12:30 a.m. at the exact spot I would have been if I'd have continued my jog. This happened the day after she passed, when it was starting to greatly affect me. I had a dream I was at the location she was shot at, and I was looking for her in a panic. When I saw her, She was wearing the same outfit she passed in. I told her, "You need to get out of here. Someone is coming with a gun to kill you." She hugged me and said, "I know. Don't worry. Everything will be okay." I said, "How would everything be okay?" And I think she just said, "Don't worry. You'll see." But I can't remember that part clearly. This was so long ago, I can't remember every dream, but I just remembered this one. I woke up early one morning. I was half asleep on my bed, and I was worried about something I couldn't remember what. I remember, and I wasn't fully asleep, but my eyes were closing, and I remember she sat on my bed and placed her hands on my arm. She sang, "Just close your eyes. The sun is going down. You'll be alright. No one can hurt you. Come morning light, you and I will be safe and sound." If that song sounds familiar to you, it's because Taylor Swift sang it. The only weird part is that I'd never heard it before. That night, I was on YouTube and found a video of the girl who passed popped up. It was a cover of her singing that song, and the last dream I remember related back to that song. For some reason, I was worrying about the afterlife and what would happen. Before I went to sleep, I prayed for some sort of sign. In my dream, there was a bright light, and I heard someone sing, "And I know you'll take my hand and come to where I am, here where no one can hurt you, here where no one can hurt you, and I know you'll see the light and come to where I am." When I woke up, I searched those lyrics to see if it was maybe a song I heard her cover of Safe and Sound mentioned previously popped up, but those aren't the lyrics. I know this all sounds crazy, but it's true. I grew up in a relatively small Midwest town, so when someone went missing, it was big news, and everyone would talk about it. A while back, a 13-year-old girl wound up missing, and it was all people were talking about for a few weeks. We were the same age, just went to different schools, so it hit close to home for me especially. A few days after her disappearance was in the news, I started having these vivid dreams, where I felt that I was living first person in this girl. I never saw what I looked like, I just knew I was her. I would always be in the same dream, where this couple that lived a couple of blocks away from my actual house would drive up and grab me as I was walking and shove me into their car. The dreams were extremely graphic, and I always ended up being thrown into a ditch about a mile away from the house. I would wake up screaming, and it even got to a point where I didn't even want to go to sleep and would pull all-nighters because I was afraid of having the same dream again. The dreaming went on for maybe a week or two, and then it suddenly stopped. A few days after they stopped, the authorities found the missing girl's body sadly. She was found in the same ditch I dreamt, exactly in the same spot, only a mile from my house. It still kind of creeps me out, and I kind of feel guilty for never telling the authorities about the couple in my dream, or about the ditch where the girl was found. But I genuinely thought they were just nightmares from all the talk in the town, and even after they found her, I didn't want to waste the authorities' time with speculation. I'm normally a pretty skeptical person, but I still can't explain this. I am now 25, in middle school, and I became best friends with a boy, James, and a girl, Dee. These kids were my lifeline in a dark time in my life, and I cannot stress enough how much I needed them then. I thought of them as my brother and sister. I thought we would be friends forever, We planned our lives on how we would buy a farmland with 3 houses and live our happy lives. But that wasn't in the cards. James and Dee had a big falling out the first year of high school. I remained friends with both, but James purposely distanced himself from me as high school progressed. James fell in love and married barely out of high school. Senior year 2012, Dee died a violent and premature death in a car crash, and it wrecked me. I mourned for years, memorized her in 2 tattoos, and felt/feel her presence in multiple ways, and feel as if I can call out to her and still reach her. And the song that we last listened to frequently on the radio is When I Think of Her. I dreamed a year or so back of seeing her again. I was 100% in this reality in the dream. I was shocked she wasn't dead, and she offered an excuse as to why she faked her death. We spoke throughout the dream and caught up on our jobs and lives. She was more mature, more slender, still had the same hair, braces gone, tattooed, now a woman like me, and not forever 17. But I woke up back to reality, and she was still 17 and in an urn. What happened to James shocked me. We were no longer friends, but we kept each other on social media after he added me very shortly before what was to happen. Last year, near Christmas, the healthy 24-year-old suffered his very first seizure and died that night. His young wife left a widow. It seemed to be a complete shock to everyone in his life. It turned out he had an undiagnosed heart condition. I felt immensely sad by his tragic passing, and lost life, but did not attend the funeral, as I felt it wasn't my place. I never felt James's presence, nor have I called out to him, but I did mourn him. The James everyone talks about on his Facebook page is a tall man with a deep voice and a goofy sense of humor. The James I knew was a little boy. The 3 of us did not feel so little at 12, but from my current perspective we were very little. The James I knew was a kind, hard-working and stand-up boy. Our first interaction before becoming friends in 7th grade was in 6th grade, with him scolding someone and defending me from another kid that was bullying me. Don't make fun of the new girl, then meeting me with a soft smile. He rode his bike 20 to 30 miles around the city of Phoenix to meet Dee and I while we were lazy and took the bus. Leaving my neighborhood to drive to work yesterday, I noticed a familiar bike with features I remember on his bike, like the bars on the back wheel, where his little brother would stand while holding his shoulders to hitch a ride. I think nothing of it, until I notice other features of the rider. A young kid, perhaps 13, with shaggy brown hair, around 3 inches from his shoulders, just like he had in middle school. A baseball cap like the 3 of us would wear, a baggy t-shirt and jeans like he would wear. And this kid looked at me for a solid second, though I had only moved and glanced at him, and observed that I could not see a figure on this rider that wasn't a childlike version of James. I turned out onto a main road, and he turned and began heading the same way. I got stuck at a light about 2 blocks down, and the kid was still riding in my direction. And at this moment, now he would ride up closer, and I would be able to get a look and see that it wasn't him. I had an intuition that if I looked away he would be gone. I directed my attention to the road and looked back in my rearview mirror, and sure enough, he was no longer visible. Last year, We had a student in my grade at high school die in a car accident with his mother. I'd never heard of him or met him. I didn't know until school the next day. That day, I woke up exactly an hour before my alarm, and I saw a shadow in front, blocking my digital alarm clock. I blinked and he was gone. Then in the hallway I heard a loud and very panicked, "Mummy?" School was silent, and they did an announcement explaining what had happened. I went out of class, sobbing, and I felt like it was affecting me, more than it should have, especially since I didn't know him. But when I told others about it a week later, as I didn't want to throw salt on an open wound, they didn't question me. I don't know if his spirit was going to different places searching for his mother's spirit, or if he only appeared to people who could be considered mediums. This happened to me a second time too, although it was before this. I had a cousin who lived in North Dakota, and it was blizzarding. He got in a car crash, and the other car that killed him was actually his brother. Of course, it wasn't intentional. Because of the blizzard, neither of them could really see. But it made the situation even more traumatic for my family. It had been literally years since his death. I had a very vivid dream of him in my mum's room, talking to her. He looked like he had aged, like the age he would have been had he not died. I was a little girl again, acting the way I always did to try and impress him. He told me he was there to babysit me, and I was so happy he was there. When I awoke, I cried, because the last thing I said to him all those years ago was that I hated him. I felt like he turned up to tell me that he forgave me. I told my mum, and she cried too. That day I had the dream was his brother's birthday. His brother just moved to the same state as me, and I'm convinced his spirit was coming down from North Dakota to go with his brother, and stopped by with me to tell me he forgave me. This is my mum's experience, not mine. My mum's brother died because a drunk driver ran a red light and hit him, causing a crash. The crash cut his jugular vein, and he died later on the way to the hospital due to excessive blood loss. My mum said a couple of weeks after her brother's funeral, she woke up in bed to him standing at the foot of it. At first it was just this abnormal bright light. Then it took a human shape, then shifted into her brother. He looked at her and smiled and told her, "Louise, promise me you'll always be a good girl and never give up." My mum replied, "I promise." He said, "I love you," then faded back into this light and was gone like it never happened. When my mum tells me this story, she always said that it had to be some vivid dream she had. She's a huge skeptic, but I've always awed this in this story. If anyone's wondering, according to my mum, the drunk driver who killed her brother was only charged with a DUI. The guy continued to drive under a DUI suspended license and caused 6 other drunk driving accidents. If I remember correctly, he was the cause of death for 3 people, one of which being a little girl under age 5. The 6th incident killed him. I don't remember how though. How he got away with it for so long, I'll have no clue. My mum said he was the most hated in the town she lived in, and every time he got out of jail, he'd just do the same thing again. It's a shame that so many had to suffer because of his selfish actions. My dad once told me that when his father passed away, he had put his ashes in the closet because he wasn't ready to spread them yet. Gramps wanted to be spread on our land by a big tree by the lake. My dad said that he must have waited too long because one night he was asleep and out of nowhere he woke up to the feeling of 2 icy hands around his ankles, and before he could freak about that part, those hands jerked his ass about halfway off the bottom of the bed. For some reason, he immediately knew it was his father, assuming it was because he was so abusive to my dad when he was a child, and it seemed like something he would do, and he went to spread the ashes the next morning. Never had another issue, although they also don't have any more human ashes in the house. Right after my love of my life girlfriend died in an accident, I experienced something I still can't explain. Literally one day after, I was laying in my bed on my back, with my head facing the Polaroid pictures of her that I still had hanging on my wall. I was just dozing off to sleep when I said in my own head, "Janine, I still love you. I miss you. I hope you're here." Right after that, I felt the end of my bed sink down by my right foot, like what happens when someone sits on your bed. Then I could feel what seemed like someone crawling on their hands and knees. I have a very big bed, and they were coming towards me. When whatever was in my bed with me reached me, I felt this weight on my chest like someone was laying on it, with their head right next to mine, just like how my girlfriend used to lay on me. All of this happened with my eyes closed, and I know I was half asleep. So it could have been a dream, but there was something so comforting about this presence, so calming, so soothing, like I'd never been more at peace in my life. Then my dad called me. As soon as the phone rang, the weight immediately lifted off my chest, and the feeling of immense relaxation was gone. That wasn't very long ago, a few months ago actually, so it's all very fresh in my mind. To this day, I still think she was saying goodbye to me, and I have not experienced anything like that day since. I hope I can experience that kind of universal peace again. When I was younger, I had a lot of trouble sleeping, and would sleepwalk and have terrible night terrors. This happened for about 6 years of my early childhood. For a bit of context, my brothers all lived together in an apartment, or flat as we called them in England, which was only 2 floors and had about 6 people living in them. I don't remember exactly when it started, but I began having incredibly vivid dreams of dead people that were inside my house. From what I can remember, from my pea-sized brain, they wanted to communicate with me, but I couldn't understand. Many times, it would end up in a nightmare for me, and I would sleepwalk. However, I would run and scream up and down the halls like I was being chased by something. When I was awake, I wouldn't be able to walk down the hall by myself because of people I saw hiding inside of the rooms. It got to the point where my mum had a priest over to bless the home, and after a while I stopped seeing stuff, experiencing night terrors, and never slept-walked again. Turns out the apartment block was built on a graveyard. My dad died almost 3 months ago. About 6 weeks after he passed, I had a dream that I was doing laundry and talking to my mum on the phone. I was in our old house that no longer exists, but I was the age I am now and was talking to my mum because I knew she was lonely without my dad there. So in the dream, she has to step away from the phone for a moment, and a few seconds later I hear rustling, and then my dad say, "Hey baby girl, how are you doing?" Still dreaming, I just lost it completely, sobbing and managed to choke out, "I'm okay." And his response was, "I just wanted to let you know that I love you and I miss you." And I responded that I loved him too and missed him too. That was it. A few days later, I finally tell my mum, because every time I thought about it, I started crying. And she said that she also had a dream about my dad, and that she came home and he was just sitting on the couch. She sat beside him and laid her head on his lap, something she never did. It was complicated, but my dad was gay. However, he and my mum were best friends and continued living together even after they separated. My dream was just so incredibly vivid and raw. I understood he was gone, and I have no doubt he stopped by to check in on me. It still hurts, but I'm sure someday I'll be glad to have had this dream. Both of our dreams happening so close just felt like maybe he was checking in on us. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I'm not crying, you're crying. Yeah, some of those stories were definitely hitting me in the feels. So yeah, very, very sad, very moving, emotional stories today. Creepy and emotional. Although I didn't really want to put emotional in the title. Hope that's okay. But yeah, really sad stuff. Really makes you think about death, or me anyway. The reason I wanted to focus on dreams this week is because I kept having these dreams that people I know started dying, and I'd be crying in the dreams when it happened, and I'd wake up really scared, and I'd look over and I'd see my wife, and I'd feel this relief just wash over me, because I was like, oh, at least you're here. And then, look down at the foot of the bed, see the crib, see Pandora still there, and it's like, oh, okay. It's all good. Not much to worry about. But yeah, and of course, in the morning, just check that everyone in my family's okay. Which they always are. And the people involved in the dream. But yeah, it's been some pretty messed up dreams. And lots of nightmares as well. Lots of terrible nightmares. I've never dreamt with a dead person, not as far as I believe. Not like these stories anyway. If any of you have ever had any horrific nightmares that have really, that really stayed with you from how scary they were, or anything creepy dream related happened, send it over to my email. It's Dream Week. Maybe it'll be featured at the end of the week, who knows, but get those stories in if you want them read. If you like the video, don't forget to drop a like, leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe and press the bell icon if you're new, and if you haven't already, you might as well. To share your own stories, all you have to do is email me. The link is in the description. If you can't see it, you have to press see more in the description to see what I'm talking about. You can also post it to my Reddit. That works too, if you'd like to. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.